All right, Revelation 17 through 19, verse 5. Babylon stands as the epitome of the empire that must face God's judgment due to its sinfulness. And so what we have is a collection of texts from the Old Testament, specifically of the nation-state of Babylon and of the city-state of Tyre. And what John does is weaves together pictures of the judgment of God on the sinfulness of world empires. And so this is pointing to what will happen in the end, but also reminds us of the judgment that falls on those forces of this world, on those aspects of this world that stand against God. We looked at a couple of weeks ago, Revelation 17, and I want to thank Richie Anderson for filling in with me last week. But we looked 2 weeks ago at Revelation 17, where this picture of the goddess Roma is morphed in such a way to show and to illustrate again Babylon and Tyre. And what we see in these two texts is that if there's difficulty in trying to decipher them, which we see in chapter 17, verse 6, where John said, "And I marveled." In other words, I stood amazed. Y'all, it's okay to be overwhelmed. But what we see and what we have as references that helps us in this week's lesson in chapter 18 is what we have are aspects of Babylon that come from Isaiah chapters 13 and 14, as well as chapters 37, and in chapter 25 and 50 and 51 of Jeremiah. Now, we don't have the ability to read all of those, but you can read all of those texts, and if I need to write those down, here's where a nice PowerPoint would have been nice, or maybe you could have jotted down those texts in the Old Testament. Isaiah 13 and 14, and Isaiah 47, Jeremiah 25, 50 and 51 for Babylon, and then for Tyre, you can look at Isaiah 23, and Ezekiel 26 through 28. All of these texts are the images from which John draws from in chapter 18 of Revelation. And so what happened to Babylon, the judgment pronounced on them, what happened to Tyre, what they were doing, and the judgment pronounced on them, that is the judgment that John uses to preach his lesson of the judgment that falls on the sinful human empires, but will ultimately will be a part of the downfall of the world at the end. Babylon prefigures Rome's political supremacy and oppression of the peoples. Tyre prefigures Rome's economic power and oppression. And one of the things that will shock you, if you read through chapter 18 of what we're going to look at, is how most of what we have to do in this chapter has to do not with military, but with economics. It matters how nation states use money. And here we see judgment as a result of what happens when the human appetite for more outweighs the realities of what we are called to be and do for God's good creation, this earth as well as other people and places. Revelation 18 can be broken down into parts, and that's how we're going to look at it. But know that the culmination of what all we've seen before starts coming to a head in chapters 17, 18, 19, and 20. And so these glimpses of world empires rising and falling, and judgment falling on them for sin that we've seen in the seals and in the trumpets and in the bowls of wrath. By the bowls of wrath, we get to the end, and here is that end, and it's all coming together. So it's important to think this way. But know this, God's judgment against the godless world is real. That's what I see in chapter 17, 18, and at the very beginning of 19, is that God's judgment against the godless world is very, very real. So let's think about that in the first 8 verses, but let's read this text together. So I'm going to read chapter 18 if you want to follow along with me. And we'll see here a call and then the judgment. So a call to the saints in the first 8 verses. And then in the rest of the chapter, we'll see judgment falls and why it falls. But beginning in verse 1. John writes, "After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living.'" So we're about to see the classes of people that are going to be called out as those who mourn this downfall that are seen. That is seen. Verse 4, then I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, I sit as queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. Now listen to these three scenes of mourning. They're repeated. So you find a similar structure in how these three different classes mourn the fall of Babylon, mourn the fall of Rome. Beginning in verse 9. And the kings of the earth, who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning, and they will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon. For in a single hour your judgment is come. Here's the second group. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, and chariots, and slaves, that is, human souls. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. And the merchants of these wares who gain wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud, alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold, with jewels and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. That's the second group. Here's the third. And all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors and all those who travel, and all those whose trade is on the sea, stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying, alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more, and a craftsman of any craft will not be found in you no more, and the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more, and the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on earth. Whew. Rome, y'all. Empire today. I don't know how far we'll get, but let's get started. Coming judgment calls for the saints to leave Babylon, the first 8 verses. One of the commentators said of this text, when God judges Babylon for its demonic character, prideful self-indulgence, and adulterous influence, God's people are to separate from Babylon lest they should face God's judgment. Here another angel speaks, verses 1 and 2, speaks the good news for Christians living under Roman rule, but it's bad news for Rome. By the way, there's something similar here back in Matthew 24 and 25, when Jesus calls those residents of Jerusalem, beware of these signs of the end and get out of town. Why I think much of what happens, and this is not part of this lesson, why much that I think happens in Matthew 24 and 25 has to do with the fall of Jerusalem, not necessarily at the end, was the fact of how those realities happened when the Romans came to town and they conquered Jerusalem. Remember, that's part of where this connection to Babylon comes from. It was the Romans who came and tore down Jerusalem and executed all the people in AD 70. I think Revelation was written after that, which it makes the parallels. But you will notice in chapter 24, and at the beginning a little bit of 25, but mainly in 24, how there's a time structure, and Jesus says, hey, y'all get out of town. And as a matter of fact, what we learned in AD 70 is that many of Christians saw the Romans coming, and while many of the Jews that were in Jerusalem said, hey, we can fight them, God is on our side, a lot of the Christians that were still meeting there said, wait a second, Jesus said run, because this is going to end badly. And many Christians ran. Fun fact, it did end badly for Jerusalem and those within it. So here you see these parallels. But ultimately a judgment falling. So here is this angel who speaks. And he reminds what we've seen so far in Revelation when it comes to the judgment of God. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. The mightiest empire the world had seen yet, militarily, politically. And here in Revelation, economically, is facing God's judgment. Notice the past tense. Some call that the prophetic future. Fallen, fallen is Babylon. How is it spoken in the past tense? How do we speak of some things in the past tense that haven't happened yet?
Because we're so assured that they will happen that we can speak as if they did.
Yes, because we are so assured that they will happen that we can speak of them as if, right, it did happen or will and has happened. That's called, by way of language, that's called the prophetic future. It's a unique way that oftentimes those in the Bible write. They write future activities in the past tense because of the certainty of it. If God says it'll happen, guess what? It's going to happen. So you can look at it as if it's already happened, even as you're waiting for it. But it's a unique way that the past tense is used sometimes in the original language that some scholars call it the prophetic future, which I think is neat. But that's what you find here with this fallen, fallen. That's past tense. But wait a second. Even today, Rome still stands. Well, I'll go and tell you that empire has fallen. And here again, remember we're talking about the culmination of all of it. And so here is these world empires coming and going as judgment falls and why judgment falls. But in the end, we're going to see some incredible end in the end. But Revelation 14:8 has already introduced some of these thoughts. By the way, this language that's used for Babylon was echoed, of Rome was echoed of Babylon itself by King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 4, verse 30. In King Nebuchadnezzar's own words, "Is not this great Babylon which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" Does anybody remember what happened next to old Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah. He kind of turned into an animal, right? Eating grass, long fingernails, old hair, right? How many years was it? I forgot. 7 years. Huh, interesting. Good number, huh? Right? And then he comes to his senses, and then what happens at the end of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah, he bows before the Lord. But here you see a proclamation by Nebuchadnezzar, the same proclamation that those in Rome seem to have been making about their greatness. It's amazing that so often when it comes to worldly powers, when it comes to empires, they never learn.
Daniel had his dream.
The first dream, in chapter 2.
So he had already told Nebuchadnezzar, this is what's going to happen.
And then has some at the end of Daniel where he's like, I don't know what's about to happen. But John was like, wait a second, this is what all Daniel was seeing and talking about. And that's a beautiful way of seeing this apocalyptic literature that we've been looking at, obviously, all throughout Revelation, of how you see these sights and these visions, but you embrace these realities. But it seems interesting, why don't empires ever learn? Because it seems like those in the middle of them, when everything's going well, they automatically always think what? Nothing's ever going to stop us. Nothing's ever going to defeat us. Yeah, 1,000-year reign on some, right? With a right. Yeah. Other people look at economics. Other people look at military might. You're like, hey, this will never end, right? Right? Right?
We do that on such a micro level as well. I'll have something before me and I'll pray and pray, God, please help me. And I can't do it by myself. Then He helps me and I get it done. And I think, oh, look how good I did.
Yeah. God, I need help. God, I need help. God, I need help. God, I need help. That's every sermon, isn't it, Joe? God, I need help. God, I need help. And then how well did I do or not do? And God's like, what were you talking about, dude? Come on, man. Like, just leave it there. Leave it there. But in verses 2 and 3, you find that downfall, but then ultimately you see also that the powers behind these things, without opening up a can of worms, but we've already seen that through Revelation, these forces at work in the world, there is a demonic influence behind it. Right? We spent 2 chapters in chapters 12 and 13 looking at the dragon and the false beast and the false prophet, these spiritual forces that undergird so much of the things that corrupt this world. And here that's exactly what you see as part of this fall, of seeing the reality, a place for demons. And it's not necessarily, right, the horns and the pitchforks, right? It's not meant to be some horror movie today, right, of all this demon possession type stuff. But you see these sinful forces and you're like, how does just a wave of hate take hold? How do waves of violence take hold? How do waves of just abandoning aspects of basic humanity and morality just all of a sudden dissipate, it seems like, in a force of individuals? The only explanation that I've got is that there are other forces that exist in this world carrying those things along. And you can lean in one direction to be against them, to be insulated against them even. If I read Ephesians 6 right, with the armor of God, or you can be one who very easily is swept up by them. Here you see these underlying forces. Y'all, it doesn't have to be the devil stamped on something. We've already seen that with the mark of the beast, right, versus the seal of the Spirit. It's not had to do with some kind of mark. It doesn't have to necessarily have to do with something outwardly, but you can see the things that belong to God versus those that don't. And here is just that calling out. Where does this idea come from? If somebody would go to Isaiah 13, that was one of the texts of Babylon that was mentioned. But here's a prophecy concerning the downfall of historic Babylon, the Babylon we might say in the ancient Near East of the Old Testament. If somebody would read Isaiah 13, verses 19 through 22 for me, please.
And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there. But wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will dwell, and there wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant palaces. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged.
John, again, drawing these imageries, right, these images from the Old Testament. And what is this place filled with? A haunt for every unclean. Do you notice the contrast that's there? You see, unlike heaven, and by the way, remember, one of the great ways, John, being the preacher that he is, has layers to this, right? So you have these Old Testament images pointing to these realities of Rome. You have the realities of Rome, right, when it comes to presently what's happened spiritually. But one of the great things you can also read about this downfall and the greatness of this empire and its corruption is against the glories of heaven in chapters 21 and 22. So whereas chapter 21 and 22, when it comes to the new creation, when it comes to heaven, right, there you find what? No unclean thing. What do you see here in Babylon? It's filled full of what? Every unclean thing. And you see here that element of unclean animals being mentioned in this fall of Babylon. Here, it's filled full of that. What makes that judgment a reality? What makes it is because of exactly what makes it up. Why judge Rome? Because of its sinful influence. Nations and kings and merchants have all been swayed by its power. And by the way, churches can become corrupt as well. Go back to chapter 2, verse 22. And you'll see a call out to the church there. Don't be like this. You're getting awful close to falling down that rabbit hole with these elements. The word is intoxicated. What's that phrase? Power corrupts, and absolute power what? Corrupts? Absolutely. And that's what you see. By the way, add money in economics. By the way, what will people do for money? Anything. Yeah.
So, in verse 4, another voice, is that to be another angel saying? And I heard another voice saying.
Yes, ma'am. I believe so. I believe so. So here you have these beautiful voices coming in. Remember all these aspects of these beings around that are part of this proclamation and revealing things that are to John. I've heard different scholars kind of play up the different angels and the amounts, or just simply, I kind of take it from some of my studies in that Here you just find this unified voice of all of heaven proclaiming. Right? And so these angels and their different messages do have meaning, but not necessarily, right? And I guess they have meaning in the sense is, hey, this is the voice of heaven, all of these elements of heaven coming together to show the truthfulness of this, so to speak. But y'all, what we see here, verses 3 and 4, that wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, the kings committed immorality, merchants grown rich, her luxurious living, y'all. I think it's safe to say that luxury and immorality are pretty attractive, aren't they? When it comes to the flesh. Right? Cole's cash can be nice, but money spent on Rodeo Drive is a little bit better. No offense. Right? You can buy something nice or you can get something really nice. You know what I mean? And how we feel about some of that stuff. But ultimately, it's all opposite of the life that's found in God. And so, coming to verse 4, you find that divine command to leave. And this was not necessarily about a physical move, as I think what we see in those churches in the first, or in chapters 2 and 3, is this spiritual departure. I guess if people are coming to town to tear down the city, it might not be a bad idea to leave. But here it's not necessarily change your address. Because again, we're talking about elements of an empire. But here it's that constant call, like what we see in chapters 2 and 3, of leave Babylon. Don't make your home in this place like this. Live differently. Be differently. Which is what we've seen throughout the Old Testament. By the way, you see this in Jeremiah 51:45 and 48, verse 20. But think of Paul's writings, because I think that has something to do with what we're talking about here. In 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 and 17, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Verse 17 of 2 Corinthians 6, therefore go out from their midst, and be separate for them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and I will welcome you. Y'all, 1 Corinthians tells us we have to live in this world. We have to operate in the world in which we live, by way of our jobs, we live here, right? But we sing that song, don't we? The world is what? Not my home. Right? And that's that sinful, worldly aspect there. Yes, my address is here. Yes, this is my community. Yes, I'm going to work well for my community. That's biblical. But the corruption that we see in this world sinfully, that right there is what is being called to leave. I think the idea here beautifully is surrounding, this is a beautiful picture of holiness. A devotion to God, a separation from that which is unclean. Which, by the way, is always what God's people were called to be. Exodus 19, I am setting you apart. Exodus 19, before the law was given, as Israel becomes a nation there, before the mountain, before the law of God was given, I cannot emphasize Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6 enough. To me, it is one of the pivotal texts in all the Old Testament, by God declaring to Israel, this is who you were supposed to be for the world. And who were they supposed to be for the world? A light. A kingdom of priests. Yeah. A treasured possession. We as God's people stand between heaven and earth trying to bring the two together. This sinful world we're trying to bring to God. The things of God we live in such a way to shine lights and bring into the world. That's what a priest does, is stand in between God and humanity. And we as that kingdom, that's what we do today. The things of God we bring into this world by how we live. And as we encounter this world, we try to bring it back to God. And here, this is a spiritual leaving by saying the temptation will always be to bleed over. Read chapters 2 and 3 again. To let too much of the world come in. We have to guard against that. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Faith.
I have a two-part question.
All right, I'll try to answer it.
The first part, was John the last apostle to live?
Traditionally speaking, yes. Many believe that he was the oldest apostle, that all the rest had passed away or been martyred. You know, kind of we have some church history that leans. He died a natural death. He kind of suffered along the way. But tradition holds, again, no Bible verse, but tradition holds that he was way on up there, pushing, 90s, close to a hundo, so to speak. So tradition says that he might more than likely by the time of Revelation, very likely he was the last living of the 12. Yes, ma'am.
The Sept, it was 400 years after this before the first part of Rome fell.
Yes.
It's a pretty long time.
Yep.
So, do we think maybe the reason that John had this revelation was because he was the last apostle and may have been the last opportunity?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. Miss Faith just said, the reason John was picked is because he was the last, and this was the opportunity to kind of wrap it all up, literally. I think that's a very logical conclusion. I can't say that for certainty, because there are elements of Paul's writings that speak of the end of time, and then you have in the Gospels written decades earlier aspects, I think, also taught about end times as well. But John is given kind of this final vision, because to me, at the end of the first century is where so much of Rome's power, you might say, had come to just such a powerful peak. Like for the next 200, 300 years, before this decline kind of starts happening in the 3rd century and Christianity gains its momentum, here the church is at its infancy but beginning to grow. And here is Rome at ultimately kind of its ascendant power. Right? And so here is this beautiful literature, this beautiful text that is meant to continue to encourage that church to press forward and to let them know what seems impossible, which would be this incredible empire, the greatest that has ever seen, again here at its pinnacle. Right? That's not what wins in the end. And so there's a beauty to that, I think. And John maybe making his home base in Ephesus, again, where these churches were in Asia Minor, can be the one to be in a place where all this occurs, right? Because tradition kind of holds that John ended his life in Ephesus, right? And at least that's kind of what tradition teaches. But yeah, I think those are two very valid aspects without necessarily putting a Bible verse on it, right? But what we see is that in God's new creation, you do see, bringing it back to verse 4, this idea of holiness, right? And so what it is leaving for a spiritual transformation, and don't necessarily look at this like a geographic location, right? And so God is there to protect His people, and the end goal of our faithfulness is always in view, even when it's called up in judgment. And so in verses 5 through 7, we'll just go into the bell here, is that divine judgment is demanded and explained. And that payback double has kind of caused a lot of trouble, because you're like, if God's fair, why double? But I guess we'll just answer that next week. So
that's
try. That's it. That's right. I haven't forgotten. I got in. So there you go. We'll talk more about this. We'll try to make a little hay next week. Any questions, comments, side remarks? I'll have a PowerPoint next week. Sorry again. Thank y'all.